Most people spend their lives trying to be liked. They think approval is safety. They think kindness protects them. It doesn't. If you study power carefully, you start noticing something uncomfortable. The people who truly control situations rarely depend on being liked. They depend on being respected and unpredictable. This was one of the quiet lessons behind the thinking of Machiavelli. He observed rulers, generals, merchants, and political families. Over time, he noticed something very consistent. The safest person in any system is not the nicest one. It is the one others cannot easily attack. That is the beginning of becoming untouchable. Untouchable does not mean aggressive. It does not mean cruel, and it certainly does not mean loud. Real untouchability is quiet. It is the state where people instinctively avoid crossing you. They may not even fully understand why, but something about your position, your behavior, and your reputation makes them pause. Before we go deeper, you need to understand the first rule. Power is protection. Dependence is vulnerability. Most people live inside invisible chains of dependence. They depend on approval from coworkers. They depend on emotional validation from friends. They depend on bosses for stability. They depend on groups for identity. And the moment someone depends on approval, they can be controlled. Machiavelli noticed this centuries ago. People who fear losing approval cannot make strong decisions. They hesitate. They compromise too early. And once others detect this weakness, pressure begins. Small pressures at first, requests, expectations, subtle manipulation. Over time, the person who wants approval becomes predictable, and predictable people are easy to corner. Untouchable individuals do the opposite. They reduce dependence. They slowly build positions where their stability does not rely on any single person or group. This could mean knowledge. It could mean financial independence. It could mean influence. It could mean reputation. The specific tool is less important than the principle. You must always be harder to remove than you are to keep. Think about organizations. Every workplace has people who are constantly worried about being replaced. Then there are a few individuals everyone avoids confronting, not because they are loud, but because removing them would create too many problems. They understand systems. They know how information flows. They have relations across different groups. They control pieces of the environment. That is the first layer of untouchability. You become structurally inconvenient to attack. Machiavelli repeatedly emphasized this idea when discussing rulers. A prince should never rely only on goodwill. He must also make himself necessary. When people need your presence for stability, they hesitate to threaten you. This is not manipulation. It is strategic positioning. And the earlier you understand this principle, the faster your life changes. From this moment forward, start observing something. Look at every environment you enter, a workplace, a social circle, a business partnership. Ask yourself one simple question. Who here can be easily removed and who cannot? The answer will reveal the hidden structure of power, and once you see it, you will begin understanding how untouchable individuals quietly build their position. But this is only the first layer. The deeper layers involve perception, control of information, and the careful management of reputation. That is where the real game begins, and that is what we will explore next. Once you understand the first rule, reducing dependence, the next step becomes much more subtle. Real power rarely begins with authority. It begins with perception. Most people believe influence comes after success, but if you watch closely, you will notice the opposite. Influence often comes before success. This was another observation repeatedly emphasized by Niccolò Machiavelli.
He understood something fundamental about human psychology. People do not judge reality directly. They judge appearances. In The Prince, Machiavelli wrote that people judge more by what they see than by what is true. Very few people investigate deeply. Most simply observe behavior, reputation, and signals. This creates an opportunity. If perception shapes judgment, then whoever controls perception controls the environment. Untouchable individuals understand this early. They manage the image others see, not in an artificial way, but in a deliberate one. Notice something interesting. In every organization, there are people who talk constantly about their work. They explain everything they do, they justify every decision. Ironically, these people often appear less powerful. Why? Because constant explanation signals insecurity. Untouchable individuals behave differently. They speak less, but when they do speak, it carries weight. They do not rush to defend themselves against small accusations. They do not react emotionally to minor challenges. Silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty creates caution. Machiavelli warned rulers against exposing themselves too frequently. When people see you constantly reacting, they begin to measure you. They learn your patterns. They learn your emotional triggers. And once someone knows your reactions, they can control your behavior. Untouchable people deny others this advantage. They remain difficult to read. Sometimes calm, sometimes distant, sometimes friendly, but never predictable. This unpredictability forces people to think carefully before acting against you. Another element of perception is selective visibility. Most people either hide completely or overshare everything. Both approaches create weakness. The untouchable strategy sits in the middle. You allow others to see enough competence to respect you, but you never reveal the full extent of your capabilities. If people know exactly how powerful you are, they can calculate how to challenge you. But if they are unsure, they hesitate. This hesitation is protection. Machiavelli observed this dynamic repeatedly in political environments. Leaders who exposed all their plans invited resistance. Leaders who revealed nothing created suspicion. But leaders who revealed just enough created controlled uncertainty. And controlled uncertainty keeps people cautious. There is another reason perception matters. Reputation travels faster than reality. A single story about competence can circulate through an entire organization. A single moment of visible confidence can reshape how people see you. Untouchable individuals understand this deeply. They do not chase constant recognition. Instead, they allow carefully chosen moments to define their reputation. A calm decision during a crisis, a precise comment during an important meeting, a solution when everyone else is confused. These moments echo. People remember them. Over time, a narrative forms. This person knows what they are doing. And once that narrative exists, attacking you becomes risky, because challenging you now means challenging the reputation others already believe. This is how perception becomes armor. Not loud, not dramatic, but quietly powerful. Yet perception alone is not enough. If the first rule is reducing dependence, the second rule is controlling perception, then the third rule becomes even more strategic. It involves understanding how information itself is power, and the people who master information become far harder to threaten. We will explore that in the next part.
After perception, the next layer of untouchability becomes much more strategic. It involves something most people underestimate: information. Powerful people rarely rely only on strength or authority. They rely on knowing more about the environment than others do. This principle was deeply understood by Niccolò Machiavelli. Throughout his analysis of rulers, courts, and political systems, one pattern appeared repeatedly.
The most stable leaders were the ones who understood the full landscape before anyone else did. They knew who was loyal, they knew who was ambitious, they knew who secretly disagreed. Most importantly, they knew what people wanted. Untouchable individuals develop this habit early. They observe more than they speak. While others focus on expressing opinions, they focus on collecting signals. Small signals. Who speaks confidently in meetings? Who becomes silent when certain topics appear? Who aligns with which group? Who avoids which conversations? Over time, patterns emerge, and patterns reveal the true structure of any environment. Most people only see the surface. Untouchable individuals see the network underneath. This knowledge changes everything. When you understand the motivations of people around you, you stop reacting blindly. Instead, you begin predicting behavior. You can sense conflict before it appears. You can identify alliances before they become obvious. You can notice tension before it escalates. This foresight gives you something extremely valuable: time. And time is one of the greatest advantages in strategic environments. Machiavelli repeatedly warned rulers about reacting too late. By the time a threat becomes visible to everyone, it is often already powerful. Smart leaders detect threats when they are still small. They notice dissatisfaction in early conversations. They observe when loyalty starts weakening. They recognize when ambition begins growing in someone else. Untouchable individuals apply this principle everywhere. In business, in organizations, even in social circles. They never ignore early signals. Another important aspect of information is controlled communication. People reveal far more than they realize. Every complaint exposes a frustration. Every ambition reveals a desire. Every criticism reveals insecurity. When you listen carefully, people unknowingly describe their weaknesses. Untouchable individuals remember these details, not to attack others, but to understand leverage. Because leverage is not created through force, it is created through knowledge of what matters to people. Once you know what someone fears losing, you understand their behavior. Once you know what someone wants desperately, you understand their decisions. And when you understand decisions, you can navigate situations calmly while others panic. There is also another reason information creates protection. People are cautious around individuals who seem well-informed. If others suspect that you understand the environment deeply, they become careful about opposing you, because they are unsure what you might already know. This uncertainty discourages confrontation. Machiavelli understood that rulers who stayed informed through multiple sources rarely lost control. They were never surprised. Untouchable individuals apply the same principle. They do not rely on a single perspective. They observe different groups. They listen to different opinions. They quietly connect pieces of information. Gradually, they build a complete picture of the system. And when you understand the system better than most people inside it, you gain an invisible advantage. Because you are no longer reacting to events, you are anticipating them. However, knowledge alone does not guarantee safety. Many intelligent people still become vulnerable. Why? Because knowledge without discipline creates exposure. The next layer of untouchability involves something far more difficult: the control of emotion and reaction. This is where many people lose their advantage. And that is exactly what we will examine next.
At this stage, you understand three foundations of becoming untouchable: reduce dependence, control perception, understand information. But there is a fourth principle that quietly determines whether these strategies survive under pressure: emotional discipline. Most people lose power not because they lack intelligence. They lose it because their emotions become visible leverage for others.
This is something carefully observed by Niccolò Machiavelli when studying rulers and political leaders. He noticed that the moment a leader became emotionally predictable, opponents immediately began using it against them. Anger, pride, fear, the need for approval, all of these emotions can be turned into traps. Untouchable individuals learn a difficult skill. They separate reaction from response. When something happens, criticism, confrontation, disrespect, most people react instantly. Their tone changes, their expression changes, their behavior shifts. In that moment, they reveal their emotional pressure points. Once those pressure points are visible, people begin testing them. Someone may criticize more aggressively. Someone may challenge their authority publicly. Someone may provoke them repeatedly because they have already discovered the trigger. Untouchable individuals deny others this opportunity. They create a small gap between event and response. That gap may only last a few seconds, but it changes everything. Inside that pause, they analyze. Is this situation worth reacting to? Who benefits if I respond? Who is watching this interaction? Most conflicts are not private. They are performances observed by others. And whoever appears more controlled usually gains the psychological advantage. Machiavelli frequently advised rulers to avoid emotional exposure in public situations, not because emotions are weakness, but because visible emotions can be manipulated. If someone knows exactly what angers you, they can provoke you whenever it benefits them. If someone knows exactly what frightens you, they can apply pressure at the perfect moment. Emotional discipline protects you from this. It creates uncertainty around your reactions. People cannot easily predict how you will respond. And when people cannot predict your reactions, they become cautious. Another aspect of emotional discipline involves choosing your battles carefully. Most people waste energy fighting small conflicts, arguments over minor disagreements, defending themselves against every criticism, trying to correct every misunderstanding. This behavior creates exhaustion. Untouchable individuals are selective. They ignore many small provocations, not because they are weak, but because they are strategic. When you respond to every challenge, you lower the importance of your reactions. But when you rarely react, your response carries greater weight. People begin to notice. They start thinking carefully before pushing you, because when you finally do respond, it signals that something truly matters. Machiavelli described a similar principle when advising rulers about punishment and mercy. If punishment happens constantly, it loses impact, but when it is rare and precise, it becomes powerful. Untouchable individuals follow the same logic with their attention. They do not distribute their reactions freely. They protect them. There is also a deeper reason emotional discipline matters. Calm individuals think clearly under pressure, and pressure is the moment when most people make their worst decisions. Fear causes panic. Anger causes impulsive actions. Pride causes unnecessary confrontation. But calmness creates clarity, and clarity creates advantage. When others are overwhelmed by emotion, the person who remains composed naturally becomes the center of control. People begin looking to them for decisions, even without formal authority. This quiet control is one of the strongest forms of untouchability, because it is not imposed, it is recognized. However, even emotional discipline is not enough by itself. True untouchability requires one final principle. It involves something deeper than perception, information, or behavior. It involves reputation and strategic fear, and understanding how those forces shape human behavior. That is what we will explore in the next part.
At this stage, the structure of untouchability is becoming clearer. You reduce dependence. You control perception. You gather information. You master emotional discipline. But even with all of this, something important is still missing. Reputation. Not the shallow reputation of popularity, but the deeper reputation that shapes how people calculate risk when dealing with you. This idea appears repeatedly in the work of Niccolò Machiavelli. He observed something uncomfortable but very real about human nature. People are guided by two forces more than anything else: interest and fear. Most individuals only rely on the first. They try to convince others through logic, friendliness, and cooperation. Those tools are useful, but they are fragile. Because the moment someone believes they can gain more by opposing you, cooperation disappears. Untouchable individuals understand this. They do not try to eliminate conflict. They make conflict costly. In other words, they quietly build a reputation that signals one message: challenging this person is not worth the trouble. This reputation is not built through aggression. In fact, loud aggression often weakens reputation. People begin seeing it as insecurity. Real reputation forms through consistent behavior over time. For example, an individual who always follows through on commitments quickly becomes trusted. But an individual who also refuses to tolerate certain boundaries becomes respected. That combination creates caution. People know that cooperation will be rewarded, but crossing certain lines will create consequences. Machiavelli famously discussed whether it is better for a ruler to be loved or feared. His conclusion was often misunderstood. He did not say leaders should seek cruelty. He said leaders should ensure they are not easily disrespected. If people feel safe ignoring your authority, your position becomes unstable. Untouchable individuals apply this principle carefully. They remain calm. They remain reasonable. But they also make it clear that certain actions will not be tolerated. And when those lines are crossed, their response is precise. Not emotional, not excessive, just firm. This consistency builds a reputation. Over time, people begin warning each other. Be careful with that person. Not because they are dangerous, but because they are difficult to manipulate. And manipulators avoid difficult targets. Another important aspect of reputation is selective unpredictability. If someone is always forgiving, they become easy to exploit. If someone is always aggressive, people unite against them. Untouchable individuals exist somewhere in the middle. Sometimes generous, sometimes distant, sometimes strict. This unpredictability forces others to think carefully before acting, because they cannot rely on a predictable reaction. Machiavelli observed similar patterns in successful rulers. Those who were entirely gentle were eventually ignored. Those who were entirely harsh created rebellion. But rulers who mixed firmness with restraint maintained control longer. There is also a psychological reason reputation matters. Humans constantly calculate risk, even subconsciously. Before confronting someone, the mind asks questions. Will this person retaliate? Will others support them? Will this conflict damage my own position? When your reputation makes these questions uncertain, most people simply avoid confrontation. And avoidance is one of the strongest forms of protection. However, reputation does not exist in isolation. It is supported by one final principle, a principle Machiavelli understood extremely well: the principle of strategic alliances. Because no individual becomes untouchable completely alone. Real untouchability emerges when your position is connected to networks of strength. That will be the focus of the next part. By now, the structure of untouchability has become clearer. You reduce dependence, you control perception, you gather information, you master emotional discipline, you build a reputation that discourages unnecessary conflict. But there is still another layer that strengthens everything above it: strategic alliances. Many people misunderstand independence. They believe becoming powerful means standing alone, but this is rarely how power actually works. Throughout history, influence has almost always moved through networks of relationships. This was one of the recurring observations of Niccolò Machiavelli. In political systems, rulers who isolated themselves eventually became vulnerable, not because they lacked intelligence, but because power without allies becomes fragile. Untouchable individuals understand this dynamic. They do not depend on people emotionally, but they connect themselves strategically to individuals who strengthen their position. This does not mean forming shallow friendships. Strategic alliances are built on mutual benefit. Each person involved gains something valuable from the relationship. It could be information, it could be resources, it could be protection, it could be opportunity. The key is balance. If one side benefits far more than the other, the alliance eventually collapses. But when both sides gain stability from the connection, the relationship becomes durable. This is why untouchable individuals rarely burn bridges unnecessarily. They understand that today's rival could become tomorrow's ally. Machiavelli repeatedly advised rulers to think long-term about relationships. Destroying someone completely may remove a threat in the short term, but it may also create future enemies. Strategic individuals prefer managed relationships. They maintain respectful distance even with people they do not fully trust. This keeps communication open, and communication prevents many conflicts from escalating. Another aspect of alliances involves diversification. Most people place all their trust in a single group, one workplace, one network, one circle of influence. This creates vulnerability, because if that single group turns against them, their entire position collapses. Untouchable individuals avoid this trap. They maintain relationships across multiple environments, different teams, different professional connections, different communities. This creates flexibility. If tension appears in one environment, their stability does not disappear. They have other connections, other opportunities, other forms of support. Machiavelli observed similar strategies in successful rulers. Those who relied entirely on a single faction often lost power when that faction weakened, but rulers who balanced multiple alliances maintained stability longer. Another benefit of alliances is indirect protection. When someone considers attacking you, they rarely evaluate you alone. They also evaluate who might stand behind you. If opposing you risks conflict with several other capable individuals, the situation suddenly becomes complicated, and most people prefer avoiding complicated conflicts. This is why untouchable individuals rarely advertise their alliances loudly. They allow them to exist quietly, visible enough to be noticed, but not dramatic enough to appear threatening. The goal is not intimidation. The goal is deterrence. When people understand that confronting you could create wider consequences, they often choose easier targets. There is also a deeper reason alliances strengthen untouchability. They provide perspective. No individual can see every angle of a situation. Trusted connections allow you to hear different viewpoints, different interpretations, different warnings. This shared awareness prevents blind spots, and blind spots are one of the most common causes of downfall. However, even strong alliances require careful management, because relationships change, ambition grows, loyalties shift. Untouchable individuals never forget this. They appreciate alliances,
but they never depend entirely on them. The final layer of untouchability involves something more internal. It is not about perception, networks, or reputation. It is about personal evolution and adaptability, because environments constantly change, and the individuals who remain untouchable are the ones who evolve faster than the systems around them. That is what we will explore in the next part.
At this point, the structure of untouchability has many layers. You reduce dependence. You manage perception. You collect information. You control your emotions. You build reputation. You form strategic alliances. But even individuals who master all of these principles sometimes fall. History is filled with powerful people who appeared untouchable for years and then suddenly collapsed. Why? Because they stopped adapting. This was another lesson repeatedly observed by Niccolò Machiavelli. He noticed that leaders often failed not when they lacked strength, but when their old strategies no longer matched new circumstances. Environments change constantly. Political climates shift. Organizations evolve. Allies become rivals. Technologies transform entire industries. People who rely too heavily on a single strategy eventually become predictable, and predictability creates vulnerability. Untouchable individuals avoid this trap by developing a mindset of continuous adjustment. They observe changes carefully, small changes, changes in leadership, changes in group dynamics, changes in what people value or fear. While others ignore these shifts, they quietly adapt their behavior. This adaptability is rarely dramatic. It often happens in subtle ways. For example, someone who once spoke frequently in meetings may suddenly choose to listen more. Someone who previously stayed quiet may begin contributing strategically. Someone who once focused on one skill may start developing another. These adjustments allow them to remain aligned with the environment. Machiavelli described a similar principle when discussing fortune and human strategy. He believed that success often depends on whether a person's behavior matches the nature of the time they live in. A bold approach may succeed during chaotic periods, but the same boldness may fail during stable periods. Untouchable individuals remain aware of this. They do not cling emotionally to a fixed identity. Instead, they treat identity as a flexible tool, sometimes assertive, sometimes restrained, sometimes visible, sometimes quiet. This flexibility makes them difficult to categorize, and people who cannot categorize you cannot easily predict you. Another important element of adaptability is learning speed. Most people repeat the same mistakes because they resist feedback. They defend their decisions. They blame circumstances. They protect their ego. Untouchable individuals behave differently. They treat mistakes as information. If something fails, they study why. Was the timing wrong? Was the communication ineffective? Was the environment different than expected? This analysis improves future decisions. Over time, their understanding becomes deeper than those around them. They evolve faster, and evolution creates advantage. There is also a practical side to adaptability: skills. The more capabilities you develop, the harder it becomes for others to limit your options. Knowledge in multiple areas gives you flexibility. If one path becomes blocked, another becomes available. Machiavelli often warned rulers against relying too heavily on a single form of strength. Armies change, economies change, political alliances change. Leaders who survived were the ones who adjusted their strategies when conditions changed. Untouchable individuals apply the same logic to their own lives. They never assume their current position is permanent. They continue learning.
they continue observing, they continue strengthening their abilities. This quiet preparation ensures that when change arrives, and it always does, they are ready. However, there is still one final layer left, a principle that ties all the others together. It is not about power, it is about detachment, and understanding why those who appear least attached to outcomes often gain the greatest control. That is what we will explore in the final part.
By now, the structure is complete. You reduce dependence, you manage perception, you collect information, you control emotion, you build reputation, you develop alliances, you remain adaptable. But there is one final principle that quietly ties all of these together: detachment. Without detachment, every previous strategy eventually weakens. This final lesson appears repeatedly in the thinking of Niccolò Machiavelli when he studied rulers who survived long periods of political uncertainty. He noticed something surprising. The most stable leaders were rarely the most emotionally invested in every outcome. They cared about their position, but they did not cling desperately to specific situations, people, or victories. Why? Because attachment creates leverage for others. When people know what you cannot live without, they gain influence over you. If someone knows you fear losing approval, they can threaten rejection. If someone knows you fear losing status, they can challenge your image. If someone knows you fear losing control, they can create chaos. Detachment removes these pressure points. Untouchable individuals do not depend on constant validation. They do not depend on winning every argument. They do not depend on being admired by everyone. This creates a psychological advantage, because when someone tries to manipulate them through pressure, the tactic simply fails. They remain calm, not because they do not care about their life or goals, but because they understand something deeper. No single situation defines their stability. Machiavelli observed that rulers who clung too tightly to control often made reckless decisions when threatened. Fear of loss pushed them into impulsive actions. But rulers who maintained uncertainty maintained clearer judgment. Untouchable individuals apply this principle in everyday environments. They approach conflicts calmly. If cooperation works, they welcome it. If someone becomes hostile, they adapt. If an opportunity disappears, they move toward another. This flexibility comes from inner stability rather than external control. Another effect of detachment is emotional clarity. When someone is overly attached to an outcome, they stop seeing reality clearly. They interpret events emotionally. They exaggerate threats. They underestimate risks. Detachment restores perspective. It allows a person to evaluate situations without panic or ego. This clarity often leads to better decisions than those made by people who are emotionally invested in proving themselves right. There is also a paradox hidden inside detachment. When people sense that you are not desperate for their approval, they often respect you more. When they sense that you are not afraid to walk away from unhealthy dynamics, they become more cautious. When they realize they cannot easily pressure you, manipulation stops working. This does not mean rejecting relationships or opportunities. It simply means not surrendering your stability to them. Untouchable individuals participate in the world fully. They build relationships, they pursue goals, they create influence. But internally, they maintain independence. If something changes, they adjust. If something ends, they continue. This mindset protects them from many traps that capture others. Because the moment someone becomes emotionally trapped inside a system, that system gains power over them. Detachment prevents this. It ensures that your identity remains larger than any single environment. And when people sense that independence, something interesting happens. They begin treating you differently, more carefully, more respectfully.
because they understand, even if subconsciously, that you cannot easily be controlled. This is the true meaning of untouchability. Not dominance, not aggression, but strategic independence combined with disciplined awareness. It is quiet, it is subtle, and it often goes unnoticed by those who only look for loud displays of power. But in every organization, every social system, and every political structure, there are always a few individuals who quietly follow these principles. They rarely attract unnecessary attention. They rarely fight unnecessary battles. Yet their position remains stable while others constantly struggle. That is the result of understanding power at its deeper level, not as force, but as structure, perception, discipline, and independence combined. And once you begin seeing the world through this lens, you will start recognizing these dynamics everywhere.